greater understanding of these things. I'm sure we've studied many times in the past, but we always learn. You always open our eyes to new things. So bless us. Let your Spirit be with us. And bless us, dear Father, we pray in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Matthew. If you have your Bibles and or your notes, we're on chapter 6. If you brought your notes with you, of course, it's page 36. And as we do normally when we send out the class material, the new material is always in red, so you know where to print from without having to reprint the whole thing. But in chapter 6, and we'll probably spend our time here today and let you work on chapter 7 on your own. Chapter 6, I think, has more of the heart of what Jesus was trying to compile, trying to draw it together of his time with his audience that he was teaching to in this experience of the Sermon on the Mount. But so trying to follow the notes as best we can so we don't get me confused and try to make a right turn when I should be straight ahead. The Lord starts out this chapter with a personalized message to his disciples. He's not talking about the broad life of all those around him. He's now beginning to scope in. He's now beginning to get their attention to themselves and him in that relationship, if you would, and to convey to his listeners and those who have followed him some specific guidance of things that are on his heart and his mind. And if you begin with chapter 6 and you begin to read through it, you begin to see that he addresses several practices that have been in force or in vogue or in effect. And he then puts his little twist to them. If you remember the last class, we talked about some of the guidelines that came from the law of Moses. And then he would make an addendum and he says, "But I say unto you," and then he would fulfill a little bit more of what perhaps the harshness or the abruptness of what was written in the law of Moses. And he would say, "But I say unto you." Well, he kind of continues this same thought in chapter 6. And as we go through it, as we look through it, we notice that there's some divisions within what he says here in chapter 6. Verses 2 through 4 deal with almsgiving. In other words, our obligation to other people, the graciousness we have, the gift of plenty and bounty that we share with others. 5 through 15 speaks toward prayer and our obligation toward God. And we'll spend a lot of time in that section here. And then in verses 16 through 18, he addresses our fasting and our obligation to oneself. So if we can understand that in this chapter 6, certain verses deal with particular aspects of our relationship with God, kind of makes it easier to see the transition from one thought to another. And when we go into chapter 6, we find out that one of the first counsels that he gives to all of us is to be very, very careful of our perceived righteousness or our almsgiving, in that when we do things, to not necessarily expect the world to appreciate what we have done, but realize that when we are generous, when we are kind, when we are benevolent to others, that is counted by God for the most part and for the greater part, for our good. And he just counsels us, that be very, very careful when we do that. He alludes to the thought of, and uses the word, the hypocrites, and this is found in verse 2. "When thou dost alms, do not sound a trumpet before thee as the hypocrites do." Now, in that day and time, a hypocrite was basically a stage actor. somebody who played a role. You know, it was a false role. It wasn't them, but they were playing something else. But the tie to this is that let us not give our alms in a false manner to expound upon ourselves, to draw attention to ourselves, to be something we are not. But let us truly allow the gift of our giving be received and be understood by God. It's a subtle thing, perhaps, and many of us have seen this. I mean, how many of us get these flyers in the mail all the time about wanting, you know, our donations and our contributions, especially in the last month and probably through November? You're going to get all kinds of them. But what about the gentleman on the street and on the corner of the highway and the little lady next door who doesn't have her grass cut? And I mean, these are alms givings. We're going to speak of that in just a moment, okay? But the Hebrew word that one of our commentators uses in the Jewish language, the Hebrew word for righteousness in general, just being a righteous person, and almsgiving is the same word. Now, we want to take righteousness a little higher because we believe, a greater understanding of what it is. But when we're speaking of, and we can go back to Doctrine and Covenants 76, and it talks about the good men of the earth who have an inheritance in the terrestrial kingdom. In many ways, those are the ones who take care of people without thought for it, because it's just the right thing to do. But when we take it a little to a higher level, then we find out that we're living in a celestial process. Jesus is asking his followers to understand that when you give alms, you are also at that point in time in a process of righteousness. And again, he alludes to the hypocrites. In verse 3, he says, "But when thou dost alms, let it be unto thee as thy left hand, not knowing what thy right hand doeth." In other words, don't have to tell the world everything there is about what you're doing. I've got a granddaughter who I counsel most of the time. You know, sweetheart, at Facebook, you don't have to tell the world everything there is going on in your life. You know, there's some things you hold to your heart. And I guess in a way, this is what the Lord is saying about that which we share and the purpose by which we share it. Alms were kind of special, and I've identified them here on page 36. And it seems that when you study the process of the life at the times of Jesus, that there were 3 times a day that alms or gift giving were publicly collected. One time is that there would be 3 men designated to go throughout the cities, throughout the communities. 3 men would go, and with a basket or whatever they had, would collect alms, and the description was for the poor of the world. And the interpretation there was that this would be provided for Jews and Gentiles alike. You did not have to be the Jewish faith or of the Jewish race to receive it. It was for the poor of the world. But the second time was that there would be 2 emissaries from the synagogue who would then go from house to house, knocking on the door, and they would be collecting for the poor man's chest. And this would be specifically for Jews. It came out of the synagogue, and it would be for the Jews only. And then the third one, of course, was at the Sabbath, like we often do, like we regularly do. We take up a collection for the support, the maintenance of the synagogue. So people were accustomed to being asked to give alms. Christ's admonition is just be wise and be personal in how you give it. The world doesn't need to know everything that we do, okay? Any thoughts? I mean, I've rambled here for just a couple of minutes, but any thoughts on what those first several verses mean perhaps to you? All right, we'll move on to page 37. Verses 5 through 15 take us into our prayer life, and especially the verses 10 through 15, which now has become known as the Lord's Prayer. And truly, I guess the world knows it that way. I have a different way of looking at it. I think it's the disciples' prayer. The Lord's Prayer was offered in the Garden of Gethsemane. And but no, this is how the world treats things and sees things. So for the most part, when we speak of the Lord's Prayer, we know it's in Matthew in these verses. In verse 5, he carefully, and I think deeply, counsels us that, where am I at here? 5, verse 7, but when you pray, use not vain repetitions, as the hypocrites do. Once again, he comes back to that stage play. And I know in myself, many times my prayers, you could just rewind them and play what was last Thursday or, last night, because our words many times are the same. But one of the things that we need to be aware of is in verse 8, and I think it's one of the most important verses when we understand our prayer life. Therefore be ye not like unto them, for your Father knoweth what things you have need of before you ask him. And sometimes when we sit in our chairs or around our altar or lay down at bed, and we say the same thing, pray for the same people, ask for the same blessings, Jesus is saying, the Lord already knows all these things. He knows what you're praying for. It's already part of his life too. So maybe, Ralph, you need to find some other ways to address the Lord. So he's given us some counsel. And the fact is that we need to be very careful to pray mainly for bringing, not for bringing a concern before God, but because we love him and because we delight to be in his presence. And that's how I think that's how his words in what is known as the Lord's Prayer then came into being. Now, when you study Matthew and Luke, you notice at the beginning of how this prayer came into being, there is a difference. Luke indicates that one of Jesus' disciples came to him and said or asked, Lord, teach us to pray. Matthew never references that. He just kind of goes in with his narrative, and Jesus said, and when you pray like this. But it's an interesting thought that Luke adds into his narrative. And there's a couple of reasons why it's interesting to know this. The Jews were very acquainted with ritual prayer. There were at least 18 that they had been taught to pray daily at different times and different circumstances of the day. And so rote prayers were part of their life. But not only that, is that they're using the analogy here is that John taught his disciples to pray. And this was while he was alive, he had his followers. And the reference was made that John taught them to pray. So when this disciple comes to Jesus and said, Jesus, teach us to pray, there's probably something inherent in it, is that if we can have this prayer by Jesus taught to us, it's our prayer. It's between he and us. It's between us and the church, and it's special. It's not the other 18 prayers and more that all of the Jews pray. So there was probably some ownership that was being requested of the Lord to teach them a particular prayer. And Jesus then begins to share, his words with them. But on page 37, I throw a little curve in here. We need to point out that the Book of Mormon's account of this prayer reads differently than either Matthew or Luke. There's no complete historical account. We have nothing in writing that says this is what happened. What we do have is the accounts of how Joseph translated, how the scribes recorded, and what came out of that. But if you do read the Book of Mormon account of the Sermon on the Mount, it is so very similar to the King James. So the question then is, why? Now, I don't have an answer. I'm providing for you some information that you might find at least, okay, make a question mark there. But anyway, out of Question Time, Volume 1, I found this statement, and that's the only thing I can find outside of church history where Joseph said this is how it was done. The scribe said how it was done, and it was written word for word. Joseph would wait for them to write it, and then he would continue on. But the answer to the question is why the King James Version and the Book of Mormon agree. A.B. Phillips was a great scholar in the early church, wrote a lot of articles. You can go back into ages ago of the Saints Herald, and you can find A.B. Phillips, very prolific writer. I've given his quote here out of that, and just part of it I want to highlight for you. He says, the scribe who wrote the manuscript of the Book of Mormon was quite familiar with the King James Bible, because at that point in time, that's what they had. The correction for the inspired version didn't come until a couple of years after the Book of Mormon was completed. At that time, great reverence was felt for the exact wording of the scriptures, and it could easily happen that one would record the language of a familiar text as he, the scribe, knew it to exist. I find that hard to take 100% verification of, because I know that from what Joseph wrote and what the scribes wrote is that the words that came from his lips were the words that were placed up on the parchment. Nowhere does it say that somebody felt that that wasn't appropriate and they changed it at the time of the translation. So I just put this in there for your thought, okay? I just struggle with A.B.'s complete description there. And maybe that's one of the days that we'll find out, why the Book of Mormon and King James line up very closely. Okay, Connie? Josh has got a mic for you.
You said they were different to begin with in the Book of Mormon, the Lord's Prayer, and in the King James. And you did say that, right?
I'm sorry?
You said
It's the Book of Mormon and the inspired.
I said in the Book of Mormon and in the King James Version, the prayers are very similar.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I noticed in the Book of Mormon, the part that is not and the other is, give us this day our daily bread.
Uh-huh. Yep. They're similar. They're not exact, but they're different enough for a Latter-day Saint to say, what happened here, okay? I don't know. It's just something for us to ponder on. Josh?
Well, we do have in the preamble, introduction, whatever it's called, I believe it's translating what Moroni said, but he says something to the effect of, if there are any errors, they're the errors of men,
Right.
that otherwise that this is, essentially profitable for doctrine kind of statement. And that's one of the things that we have to remember. Many of us have been given, thus saith the spirits, and it's still a human mind that stuff has to come through. And yes, Joseph was under the what's the word I'm looking for? The influence of the Spirit. He was under the guidance of the Spirit doing things, but it still has that filter of human mind. So whether it was just that was what Joseph was familiar with, and therefore, kind of getting ahead of the Lord stated to the scribe, or whether that same thing, as A.B. Phillips indicates, goes through the scribe's mind. Either way, I just look back to that statement in the introduction. It's like, at the end of the day, despite the influence of the Spirit, everything that we do comes through the filter of ourselves, and that further underlines and emphasizes the importance for our lives and our minds to be as close to the Lord and His ways as we can make them, to minimize the impact that has.
There could be many reasons. I don't think in any of those reasons that it lessens the impact of what Jesus was bringing to his people here on this land or in the land of his heritage. Steve?
I think Joseph Smith was under the power of the Spirit, was given the ability to translate these little symbols that he sees on a golden plate. Well, anytime you do translations, you're putting into English what the meaning. And so it'd be very easy for your mind to say, this I know, the Lord's Prayer. And but the other thing I wanted to bring out is this is also a testimony of the inspired version, because one is the Spirit giving him the power to translate. The inspired version is giving him the power to see the truth. And so when he changed the Lord's Prayer to suffer us not to be led into temptation, that's a testimony that the Spirit of teaching him the truth was really there. So to me, it's not the error in the Book of Mormon or King James Version that's at stake. It's the testimony of the power of translation, the power of truth, the power of revelation, if you want to call it that, that's in the inspired version. That's just one of the testimonies that the inspired version is of God, of His Spirit.
As I say, there are so many things we can conjecture, but to just basically say that the scribe changed what Joseph gave him to put it in his words, as Phillips alludes to here, it's a hard one for me to swallow. I just don't know if I really go that route. But that's just something, Arlo, we got a hot button here.
I think there's one other point that needs to be considered in analyzing all this, is the scribe that recorded what Christ said on this continent. Did he miss it, or did Christ skip over it?
Yep. Who recorded what, in what accuracy, how long afterwards? You have to remember, Matthew didn't record this as it happened. Neither did Luke or John or Mark. These recordings were sometimes years after their experience with the Christ. And we're relying upon, just like you and I, to remember back to 2000, what really happened in those years then. We have partial records, but I'll guarantee you there's records that we don't have that probably could be included if we just remembered them appropriately. David.
So, the Book of Mormon account was written first before the inspired version changes.
Yep.
And so if you look at from what I understand, in the manuscript of the inspired version, there are changes upon changes, and that Joseph used the section 9, study it out in your mind. Right. And so further analysis led him to make those changes. And one thing I might point out in defense of the Book of Mormon is in the Bible, it talks about cutting off your hand if it offends you. And I was reading in the George Lambsa Bible one time, and it says that was an Aramaic expression of that area. And so I thought, well, they weren't Aramaic in the Western Hemisphere. And so I went and I looked, and that is not in the Book of Mormon. So that was left out. I thought that was interesting.
Yep. Connie?
It's just a question. And I wonder if we knew the language of the time when that was written, lead us not into temptation, if that actually meant suffer us not to be led into temptation. And anybody who read that, lead us not into temptation, would know that that's what that meant. That's just what I wonder. Don't know, because God doesn't.
Albert?
The chapter 6 of Matthew on the Lord's Prayer, chapter 11, 2 through 4 on Luke, and 3rd Nephi 5, 102 through 106, they all address God the same way, our Father. When I left our historical church in in 05, 84 was the beginning of a lot of things, but I stayed 20 years longer than many of you. I was bothered by a Saints Herald that came out talking about changing prayers from the 2004 conference, changing the prayers on the communion and going to a combination prayer for the bread and wine at one setting, but also degenderizing the general prayer. It was, "Oh God, we ask thee not, we ask thee in the name of thy Son." Anyhow, we leave out the eternal Father, "Oh God, the eternal Father," in the changed prayer. And I asked for a meeting with all the priesthood at the congregation I went to, and there were 17 of us, counting myself. I was the only one with scriptures, and a lot of people that all of them I loved, but a lot of them I had some really high respect for, that kind of took me on, you might say, on what these words say, trying to degenderize God. Well, we don't, God might be our mother. And oh, really? Jesus would have not made reference to God in any other form than a man, because the Jews would have cast him out. And I said, you really think that? You don't think Jesus would have had the authority to say what it really should be? And and then there was things about Joseph and everything, but to me this is so clear. The testimony of three, that was what my point was going to be here. Matthew 6 and Luke 11, 3rd Nephi 5. The testimony of three pretty well overrides anything what anybody wants to say. We cannot change what is written, and even though these are worded a little different, the meaning is still the same. And anyhow, the spirit of the prayer that Jesus taught is the important thing, not necessarily word for word. And then again, in the writings, Abba, we know as Father. But some of the other wording, it could have been a little bit different. The Nephites had been away from their homeland for generations by this time, and 600 years. So anyhow, that wording still has that same spirit within it, so it's good for me.
When we take it as a whole, and we're going to kind of get into a lot of what you just talked about here now. I mentioned the fact that one of the things that the Jews were very, very comfortable with were formalized prayers, special throughout the day, a particular prayer, particular time. One of the things that was interesting as I went through our references that are in the very front of your book as far as what we've been studying from, there were several commentators that I found the same thought from, is that what is known as the doxology, verse 15 of the Lord's Prayer, very likely was not given by Jesus, but it was added because it is a prayer that basically closes many of the Jewish ritual prayers. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. That is something that was embedded in many of their prayers. And perhaps, like we're talking about, the author, Matthew in particular at this time, at the close of Jesus' Lord's Prayer, felt that that's a good appendage. I'll add it in. Now, it's a thought. Commentators, they know what they know. But I've told you before, the most dangerous people in the room are those who don't know what they don't know, and we espouse what we know, and it could be totally wrong. But it's just a thought to realize is that perhaps part of the Jewish prayer life itself entered into what was recorded in Matthew. Just give you something to think about there for a moment, okay? By being taught this personal prayer by Jesus, I'm on page 38 now in your papers. This could also be an especial identifier to distinguish his disciples from all other people. The prayers were solely theirs and to the church. They took ownership. This is what Jesus taught us. Just like John's disciples, what he taught them, that was theirs. And they held to that. When we see the prayer itself, when it's basically before us in these verses of 10 through 15, there are three parts that are chiefly dealing with the glory of God. And this is kind of what Ilbert was saying, all right? Hallowed be thy name is the first point that Jesus brings out for that. And this is where the glory of God is worshiped. This is where basically the utterance of that, hallowed be thy name, that itself is a worshipful phrase. Dear God, hallowed be thy name. That is our reverence to him. And Jesus is saying, this should be part of your prayer life. Thy kingdom come. Here we're looking at the world that we wish to be, where justice overcomes injustice, and where mercy over hate, and where love over anger, and where all of the other things that this world's full of, we wish to have the kingdom and all of its attributes. We're praying for it to be here. And then it goes on to say, thy will be done on earth as it is done in heaven. And here we're asking God to help form our wills into his will. Thy will be done. Well, how is his will going to be done? Basically by his followers. We do his will. We practice his life. We become the examples and the image of he and his Father. Thy will be done here as it is in heaven. And then the next four deal with our spiritual needs. Now, Jesus has taken us past our adoration and our love of the Father. Now he's talking about our spiritual needs. Give us this day our daily bread. And I don't think there's a person in the room who's not smart enough to realize we're not talking about the bread that we put on our sandwiches or we sop our plates with. Here we're speaking about the bread for our souls. What is it that feeds our souls? It allows us to receive God's pardon. and allow us to realize that he, the Christ, he is our daily bread. Fact is, his statement is, I am the bread of life. I am what feeds you. And here in his prayer, give us this day the daily life of our Christ. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And I've tried to carefully, but I think plainly describe my thought on this, is that anyone who offers this prayer who has not forgiven your enemy, the prayer is valueless to you. Why pray for something you're unwilling to give up yourself? When we hold back our, well, that's not the way I want to say it. When we allow our anger or our resentment and our sometimes even hatred of others to be the focal point of parts of our lives, and then we sit down at the dinner table, and many of us, we say the Lord's Prayer, and we come to that, forgive us our trespasses. How far do you think that prayer is reaching into the throne of God? It can't be done, folks. I don't think it can be done when we hate people, when we don't forgive them their wrongs against us. Now, I can't forgive their wrongs against you. That's you. And I can't have them forgive me for my wrongs against them. But if in a concerted effort, as if in a body of people, we truly did forgive all those who trespass against us. That was one of the beautiful things I think that Brother Joseph, our young prophet, tried to bring to the church, in the fact that all of those calamities that came against the early church, okay, they were continually reminded by Joseph, forgive them. They are in God's hands. Even when they were killed, even when they were burned out, even when they were raped, all of this. Joseph had this mindset to forgive so that he might be forgiven. Suffer us not to be led into temptation. You and I both know. Whoa, gotta holler up. Yes, Austin.
The best way that I have always heard that I've heard why we should forgive is because it's more harmful to you if you don't forgive. Mm-hmm. I heard a saying once that said, not forgiving somebody is like you drinking a poison and expecting the other person to die.
Yep.
It's harmful to you, so let it go.
Yeah, it destroys our spirits. Destroys our spirits. How many of us, I'm just thinking current here, how many of us remember 2019? Yeah. And we had our brothers and sisters, who many of them no longer with us. How do you remember, for the most part, our feelings toward them at that time? I know what mine were. I know what mine are now. This is the poison, because if we're not careful, it infects us. It poisons us. Suffers not to be led into temptation, and maybe this is part of it again. Okay? God's not going to be the tempter, but he will allow the tempter to help us utilize our agency. I love the story of Jesus coming out of the wilderness, those 40 days. You know, he's been gone. He's been out of communication with people for a month longer. And when he returns from the wilderness, it doesn't say where he came into, but out of the wilderness, the first entity that he saw was Satan. And after those 3 trials of test, what was it the Lord was able to tell Satan And I love this. Get thee behind me. You walk in my dust. I'm not walking in yours. He had no need of Satan. And this is this temptation. And a quote here from Paul, but God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that which you are able, but will with the temptation also make it a way to escape, that ye may bear it. And we all have these things that we bear. Paul spoke of his affliction that was with him, he had to bear. It didn't stop him. Now, where it came from and why it was there, he never explains. We never know. But how many of us have either spiritual, emotional, or physical afflictions that we just need to realize God's not going to give us something we can't bear? It may seem like a long road, and it may be all uphill, and we may be pushing a rock. But he says at the end of that hill, there's where you see the beauty of his creation. But deliver us from evil. And hear this final plea, that we be kept from all sin and wickedness. Deliver us from this. Keep us from the sin and the wickedness of the world, okay? Even Christ had to have that in his life. For every day he woke up, I will guarantee you Satan was standing at the foot of his cot, his bed, his knapsack, wherever he happened to be, waiting for just one opportunity to destroy the divinity of him. You think that he's not interested in the righteous? I told you a couple of weeks ago, he's not interested in the unrighteous. He's already got them. He's not wasting time there. He's already got them. He'll give his imps control there. But to you and I, he will sit there at that bedstead and he'll wait. Verses 17 and 18, and we'll make 6 here, we will. He addresses the mode of fasting and counsels us to use this opportunity not to display our overt physical reaction, but to live normally each day in dedicated prayer, meditation, ministry, and other activities. In our fasting, continue your life. The sackcloth, the ashes, all that was representative of somebody who was in fasting and mourning. He says that's not necessary. Live your life. Continue to do the things that you've been doing, okay? And any other valuable activities that you can do. The object of the fast is to blend the flesh with the spirit. How deeply do our spirits wish to be with him? Then allow the body to give that strength of fasting and prayer to it. Helaman 2:31. This is a quote I've heard some of you brothers and sisters quote in Sunday school, in our morning worship. Helaman does an outstanding job with this. Nevertheless, they did fast and pray oft. Remember, see, it's tied together. I'm just not missing an evening meal because there's a process that goes through with it. There's a prayer life that must accompany it. And they'd wax stronger and stronger in humility and firmer in the faith of Christ, unto the filling of their souls with joy and consolation, yea, even to the purifying and sanctification of their hearts, which sanctification cometh, because why? We yield to God. We say, Uncle. Remember growing up as a kid, we used to wrestle with cousins and brothers and whatnot, aunts and males and females. And who was the toughest? Who was the strongest? And when you got pinned, you said, Uncle. You gave, now we tap out. And then you just said, Uncle, and you give. Sometimes we have to yield to God. But notice what Helaman is writing. This is not a one-step process. They prayed and fasted. They got stronger and stronger and firmer. They filled their souls with joy and consolation. They purified and sanctified their hearts. because they yielded to God. You don't go from the first one to the last one. There is a process, just like our Beatitudes. From 1 to 8, you go the process. Jesus continues in verse 19 and 21. Lay not up for yourselves treasure on earth, where moth and dust corrupt and where thieves break through and steal. But lay up these treasures in heaven, for where your treasure is, there will be your heart. And here's the question, I think, and I've got it written here for us, all right? This is the, I think, eternal consternation of each of us. When we ask ourselves, where, how much, and how deep are the treasures that lie in our heart, what will be our full and total answer to be? What is it that I value so much in my heart that I am becoming like it? And how then will we answer to God when he asks us if we've done our reasonable service, which is that which is ever expected of us? The treasures in our hearts, the car, the 11 acres, the condo, the bank account, I don't know. But what treasures are there that need to be removed and allow us to lay up those treasures in heaven, so that when God looks upon us and he says, what have you done for me? And you say, well, I've done this, and I've done this, and I've done this, and I've done this. And he looks at me and he says, Ralph, I don't think I ever really knew you. Because what you did mattered more to you than it did to me. That's the conundrum that we live in today, folks. It's why you're here, why we're here, to try to understand better how he can become our bread of life. Jesus closes with an admonition for his followers not to be anxious, but to do the best we can and leave the issues to the world with him. And I'm using a quote to close this out of Psalms, Brother David. He says, rest in the Lord and wait patiently for him. Fret not thyself in any wise to do evil. Don't think about it. Don't plan on it. Leave it alone. But those that wait upon the Lord, they shall inherit the earth in that kingdom that will come. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, boys and girls, this has been a joy, been a pleasure for me. I hope you've been profited by our time together. I look forward to Brother Steve in a couple of weeks and continue on the good work. Make the kingdom come. May it come soon. Thank you.